Hello again, everyone. It's time for some geoeconomics. Okay, so my co-theme leader on this one is Christoph Trebesch, who's an actual expert in geoeconomics, which is great. And we're both delighted to be part of this initiative. Thank you very much to the organisers for including us. It's a great thing to be a part of. So, sort of the departing element. So, why are we here? We're here because armed conflict destroys physical and human capital, and conflict has all kinds of negative effects on investment and trade. The risk of conflict, the realised effect of conflict, as we saw from Matthew's paper yesterday. So because of this, obviously the FCDO agrees that understanding the causes and consequences of conflict is imperative for economic growth. A lot of us, or certainly some of us of a certain vintage, when we got into this, it was during this real change in focus to civil conflict, right? So civil conflict was more prevalent than international conflict. There were more fatalities coming out of civil conflict as well. So this was sort of a wave of sort of attention being switched towards civil conflict in the early 2000s. Our main starting point in all of this is the return of both international and internationalized conflict. Okay, so conflict involving external parties, even if it's intrastate. Okay, so that's sort of where we're planting a flag in all of this. So Lisa just showed us a picture of all the one-sided conflict and that UCDP data. So that's perfectly complementing what I'm about to show you, which is two-sided conflict over the same period, right? This is UCDP two-sided battles. That's fatalities on the vertical axis. Don't tell my graduate students I didn't put a label there. So what you have in the solid line is battle deaths from strictly domestic conflict. And the broken line is battle deaths from international and internationalized conflict, okay? So for the first 25 years of that series, more or less on average, there are far more fatalities in domestic conflict. But then around 2014 onwards, so basically the last 10 years, there are more conflict fatalities from international and internationalized conflict, okay? So that's where we're sort of changing our focus. And what is this coinciding with? I mean, take your pick, right? So a change in the international political and economic order that's still ongoing, a weakening, and I suppose laterally accelerated weakening of US hegemony, a new threat of external wars, new realization of external wars, and heavy international involvement on both sides in many local and internal wars, right? From Gaza, Sudan, Syria, Yemen, across the Sahel, and so on. So the sort of call to arms, as it were, of this theme is we need to understand a lot more about the interplay between conflict and international political economy, right? International power dynamics. So a question I asked myself very recently is, what is geoeconomics? So my co-author has written an annual review article on this, and they have a very, very broad definition, and we're going to continue that theme of keeping things broad, which is the field of study that examines the links between geopolitics and economics, okay? So you can think of this even more broadly as just, if political economy is about domestic political power, geoeconomics more broadly is on the economics of international political power rivalries, okay? And again, just to be very explicit, where how we're understanding this intersection with conflict is specifically on two broad areas. One, interstate political conflict, and the second, any external dimensions to intrastate political conflict, right? Think of causes or consequences that cross borders. So it's broad, but following this morning's meeting, I'm quite glad that it is broad. So what I'll do for the rest of this talk is very briefly touch on sort of the traditional topics at the intersection of geoeconomics and conflict. Okay, so these are areas that are pretty well researched, very active literatures. By all accounts, we welcome more proposals in these areas. But then we're going to shift our focus onto what we're calling pathfinding topics. Okay, so the traditional topics are, the age-old tools of economic statecraft from Baldwin. Okay, so think of economic incentives like aid, preferential trade agreements, and so on. And then the stick rather than the carrot, right? Economic sanctions, including embargoes and all of that. Another sort of traditional field at this intersection is on the interplay between trade and war. So the effect of trade on war, the effect of war on trade. And then the third is on, broadly speaking, just the economics of war. Okay, so war financing, the costs of war and so on, and how they propagate across borders. What we're calling pathfinding topics are maybe the geoeconomic tools that are deployed by less constrained leaders. Okay, so that's what I mean by unconstrained. So moving from economic actions towards more aggressive ones. So unarmed interventions, which I'll talk about, and armed interventions, but in a proxy way, right? So funding conflict actors across borders. We're also very interested in, just broadly understood, the cross-border drivers of conflict, including terms of trade shocks, for example, or climate shocks, and also the cross-border consequences of conflict, right? So understanding spillovers from refugees, spillovers of weapons, and so on. So very, very briefly on the traditional ones, right? So the big question in trade and conflict is, does economic integration lead to peace or conflict, right? So this is the du commerce, the Montesquieu, right? So the liberal view being that trade leads to peace because of interdependence. Dominic has some work with Silabodi and Tonig on trade and trust as sort of self-reinforcing drivers of persistent peace with multiple equilibria. And when this breaks down, it can really break down and lead to a conflict trap. And then Soumitra has work, using micro data, testing sort of the heart of the hypothesis on economic complementarities and peace or tolerance between groups, but certainly something we can learn a lot from and apply it to sort of the international dimension. The other side of this argument then is the realist view, which is that trade can also increase rivalries between states. So there might be conflict over sharing the gains from trade, for example. And then in a really pathfinding or a very consequential paper by Philippe Martin, who left us, Thierry Meyer and Matthias Tonig in 2008, they find evidence for a kind of nuanced combination of both, right? Which is that bilateral trade decreases the probability of war between those two potential belligerents because of increased opportunity costs, but almost sort of paradoxically, global integration can actually increase the probability of war because it's easier to substitute away from different trading partners, okay? So anything related to this is certainly relevant. Again, the sort of the classic heart of geoeconomics undoubtedly is this toolkit, right? The tools of economic statecraft. Okay, so this could be sanctions related to trade, financial sanctions, military, arms, travel. There's a very rich and really vibrant theoretical literature on sanctions, and also I think a very promising avenue for future empirical research is using granular data to study the impact of smart sanctions, right, on individuals and firms and so on. Again, a rich tradition studying embargoes, blockades, and related topics. So like strategic tariffs, so tariffs that have geopolitical ends, export controls, investment screening, and so on. And then the carrot rather than the stick. Okay, so for the FCDO people who are here, there is solid evidence of a positive hearts and minds impact, right? So economic aid does improve people's perceptions of donor countries. So if you're in it for the altruism or if you're in it for the geopolitics, you're getting a 2-for-1. But as I discussed yesterday, when it comes to aid, context and design are critically important for conflict, right? And there are more than one example out there of the sign being flipped if the context is not appropriate for the type of aid, or if it's aid, maybe in-kind aid, where rebel groups have a capacity to take over. Okay, and then the sort of third traditional area is on the economics of war. So, broadly speaking, we're interested in the economic costs of war, the economic cost of the threat of war, the costs themselves, including spillovers, human losses, economic damage, trade disruptions, and so on. There's also really interesting literature on war finance and military production, including some positive spillovers, right, when it comes to R&D from World War II. Or developing fiscal capacity and so on. So we broadly speaking, we view these as pretty relevant as well. But what I'd like to focus on for the next 5 minutes is on our pathway topics, right? So these are areas where we think there's scope for more research, and we're particularly enthusiastic about submissions on these issues. Okay, so starting with a less aggressive or medium aggression, so unarmed operations. So these are papers on covert operations like CIA actions. So that's the Berger et al. AAR paper, and coups, or at least the expectation of coups and how that affects stock prices for firms with an interest in a change in power in the destination country. Research on sabotage and cyber attacks. Again, this is a very new literature. This is something that's very, very topical. And I think certainly a massive gap in understanding the causes and consequences of these things. And then online foreign influence efforts, which we discussed yesterday as well. So again, understanding the impact of these interventions. And by understanding the impact of the interventions, you can learn a little bit about the strategic motives behind them. And then moving on to sort of the more or the most aggressive, short of all-out war. So armed interventions, or at least armed interventions via proxy groups. So military aid and counter-insurgency efforts if it's in favor of the state, or supporting insurgents themselves and rebel groups if you're on the side against the state. We're also interested in state-sponsored terrorism and jihadism and drawing those lines between states and terrorist groups. Another sort of element of this, unless we're missing something, we'd be really interested in understanding a little bit more about how the entire toolkit is used and understood, right? Characterizing the entire toolkit where, it ranges from, we'll say, the least aggressive economic actions, the classic tools of geoeconomics, incentives and sanctions, moving to unarmed interventions and armed interventions. And the basic idea is that you can't really understand, those two without understanding the other elements in the choice set. So, for example, it could be the case that more constrained leaders, so you could think of constraints being budget constraints or like moral constraints if you're the leader in a democracy or something like this. And maybe these are tools that are more likely used by unconstrained leaders. But thinking almost theoretically how to sort of integrate the entire choice set and understand this a little bit better. In my final minute then, this is sort of blowing the doors open a bit more. We're interested very broadly on international causes and consequences of conflict. Okay, so cross-border drivers of conflict, so political bias or unchecked power in a belligerent country, terms of trade shocks, climate shocks, the role of ethnic diaspora and movements of peoples across borders, how that can be manipulated or exploited by states. We're also interested in weapons. I'm sure there's an entire literature on inflows and outflows of weapons that I'm not aware of, but it's funny we don't talk too much about weapons despite all studying conflict, with some notable exceptions. And then we're also interested in cross-border spillovers from conflict, right? So refugees, migration, how shocks to prices can propagate across countries and across space, so food and energy prices, supply chain disruptions, and again, weapons, but this time heading in the other direction, right? The outflow of weapons. And then a final slide, if someone's at the margin of being interested in this theme and they're kind of worried that a lot of these decisions are made at the country level and there's a lot of country level variation, a lot of the innovations in this field empirically are using granular data, right? Using micro data, causal inference tools, much like the trade literature has made that transition as well. And you can see examples of it everywhere, right? So using microdata to study the impact of smart sanctions, study trade complementarities and interethnic tolerance, study the effect of trade shocks on civil conflict, and using microdata to study legislator-level decisions to understand how a state behaves, and using microdata to study the impact of expected coups. So I hope this sort of makes it a more accessible and I'd say inviting theme to think about contributing to. Okay, thank you very much. Do we take questions after our theme presentations, or we just move on to the research? Yeah.
I want to suggest an additional tool for your toolkit, or maybe an additional literature that might be interesting to include here, which is not just sponsoring terrorist groups, but also violent counterterrorism. Certainly in political science, there is a minor cottage industry on sort of decapitation strategies, drone strikes targeting terrorist groups, etc. So violent counterterrorism short of sending in the army, essentially. So that might be one to add.
Thank you. Great. There's a hand here, if there's not one somewhere else.
So I guess there's an old and also new literature on size of nations. So like back to Alesina, and like now there's a lot of like separatist papers on, yeah.
Yeah, and so that was the reason for the Michaelopoulos and Papagiannou reference. So that was the Scramble for Africa paper, and that when you have ethnic groups who are split, that leads to more violence. And part of the evidence they find is that just having ethnic diaspora at the other side of the border is something that reduces the opportunity cost of conflict. Groups can retreat and rearm and reorganize and come back in, and it can also be exploited by state actors as well. So that's very much in that tradition. I should have mentioned your talk, Tanya, because you mentioned data on external funding for non-state armed actors in your talk, which is super relevant to what we're talking
And
about.
I'm kind of going there right now as well.
Good, yeah.
But international relations, which I think maybe is the political science version, as you noted, of geoeconomics, tends to be, and it's been criticized for being overly state-centric. And so I think in your pathfinding considerations as well, thinking not just about how the state reacts and how the state funds, but how non-state actors are also a key part of geoeconomics or international relations as well. So might be a component of that, because it's not only states funding armed groups, it's the possibly other armed actors, Al-Qaeda at the head, providing a lot of money to its actors. Sorry, not a question, I guess.
Great.
A thought.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you also want to consider the international legal system, in a sense, prosecution of failed dictators and how it shapes incentives to kind of prosecute wars more severely or less severely. Because, I mean, it's, I guess, and also harboring former dictators. I mean, we all saw these images of Assad flying to Moscow and so forth, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Without wanting to stand on Lisa's toes, we're definitely interested in international organizations as well, yeah, for sure, aside from peacekeeping.
Sorry, I guess because it frames it already as competition, maybe this doesn't fall under this, but what about more woolly kind of things like, soft power and like collaboration and like talking to each other and like...
Yeah, so under economic incentives, that would be not only aid, but also preferential trade terms and anything else that is a carrot rather than a stick and is not violent.
Yeah.
We're interested in that as well.
But I mean, like in terms of like information exchange can also be beneficial regardless of whether it changes the incentives to do something, right? I mean, in the good old days, you would like send missionaries so that the other side has the same faith, and then, right, then they are more on your side because they come from a similar. And I mean in a propaganda way, right? There's a propaganda element to this, I understand as well, but there's also like a more like if we start from the same assumption, and I guess that's the idea of soft power, right? That if you educate the entire elite in your country, then they understand you, right?
Okay, very good. Let's talk offline more about that, and I'll give Dominic a chance to present his research. Unless there's any more questions. Thank you for all the suggestions. That's great. We're still putting it together. So this is all really helpful. Thank you.